La Verne can be characterized as a typical city, born in a time of agricultural enterprise and now mainly residential and commercial. However, its enduring Midwest atmosphere, connection to a multi-program university, and dedication to service and community make it a unique place with a cohesive sensibility. Several books have been written about La Verne, its citizens, university, art, and architecture. The newest addition to its literary history is part of the Images of America series by Arcadia Publishing. Simply entitled La Verne, this book tells the story in over 150 captioned photos of a city that grew and flourished with the Southern California citrus industry and remains a wonderful place to live, work, and raise a family. Written by Mr. Bill Lemon, La Verne's official city historian, and Sherry Best, representing the La Verne Historical Society, the book takes the reader from pre-1887 to the present day. Readers will learn about original Rancho San Jose owners Ignacio Palomares and Ricardo Vejar, as well as current residents whose ancestors arrived in Lordsburg in the late 1800s to pursue citrus cultivation. They will discover how the town of Lordsburg became known as La Verne, how the original Lordsburg Hotel was transformed into a college and eventually became the University of La Verne, and how streets and parks got their name, and how La Verne residents continue to contribute to community pride. The Historical Society's motto is preserving old La Verne's environment, making history for the future. It is dedicated to the memory of Galen and Doris Beery, leaders of the Historical Society, and Marlon Heckman, historian and emeritus archivist and librarian at the University of La Verne.
Can you first tell us how the book came about?
I don't really remember who. I'm sure we were contacted by Arcadia, I guess, but I'm not sure how that worked. I know that I myself have always looked for some way to put my knowledge and my photographs that I've collected and things other items I've collected over the years into some sort of context. And all I know is that when this came along, it was really an answer to that. Although then when we got started on it, I realized that we couldn't put everything in here that I knew. And so, that's been the hard part for me, is to restrict myself both in, the amount of words in the captions, and also just the types of pictures or the number of pictures. You wouldn't even be able to lift the book if I kept putting in everything that I wanted to. And so that's where Sherry, with her organization skills and her bullwhip, has been able to funnel my knowledge into something that people can stomach, I guess you'd say, so they wouldn't fall asleep reading it.
We came from a unique situation. We had, as an historical background, what is affectionately known as the Green Book, which was written by Evelyn Hollinger. But it's an enormous history of various families in the history of La Verne, but a little more narrowly focused, not as much a focus on diversity in the community and some of the things we wanted to talk about. But that was a great book for background. And then what happened is I was actually contacted by Arcadia Publishing. We didn't make any outreach. They outreached to us and said, would you consider doing this book? Well, I've had a certain amount of experience being published as part of my previous life as a university professor. So I'm used to working with publishers, and I know how they operate. And so, and I'm also very left-brained. And as Bill says, I kind of have a chair in one hand and the bullwhip in the other. So I downloaded all of their application and whipped through that really fast and got that all organized, because I know that publishers are happier to work with you when you have everything organized exactly how they want it on the timeline they wanted. And when you do that, then you've met their needs, and they're just ever so much more compatible for working with. So everything got off to the publisher at the right time. And so I can do all of that kind of thing. So I did all of the interface with Arcadia Publishing and uploaded all the links that they wanted, all of the images, and made sure they were the correct DPI and so forth and so on. And then Bill filled in so much of the content. And it's true that this book represents about 2 years worth of work, and it doesn't look like it should take so long to do. But our biggest issue is that we had kind of an embarrassment of riches. We had so much content, so many pictures, so many stories. It was like a winnowing. How did we decide what we were not going to put in and what was going to be the most relevant pictures to tell the story? I would say probably the hardest part about starting the book, and this is the way with every book, was organizing the content. So if you look at the table of contents page, there's the 7 different chapters, and I think we had begun with maybe 9 chapters, and Arcadia Publishing has a specific parameter for even how many chapters, how long each chapter has to be, how they have to be organized. I mean, they're very strict. And so we winnowed it down to these chapters, beginning with the days of the old Spanish land grant ranchos, all the way up through a very focused chapter that we call Public Art in La Verne, which is quite contemporary and something that people will look at that chapter and go, oh, I've been by that mural. Oh, I know that piece of art. That's a good thing. So we had to winnow it down that way. Then what we did is we organized thousands of pictures into categories based on each one of these chapters, because that's really the only way we could figure out where all the pictures were going to go. And we discovered that we had maybe 3 times more content for the chapter that we call Lordsburg Beginnings, because Bill has so much great historical information, but we had hundreds and hundreds of pictures for that chapter. And then in other chapters like post-war growth and change, we didn't have so many pictures, because I think a lot of people think history ended somewhere around the 1920s, and anything from the time we're born forward is today and not history, and history is today also. So we had to do a little more work to find content in chapters 5, 6, and 7, and had to go out and take some of our own pictures, particularly for the public art chapter. But we relied on Bill's stash for chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then we just had to cut and cut and cut to get to the most relevant pictures. And that was difficult. One of the chapters we had was specific to the contribution of the Church of the Brethren.
Oh, okay.
That was one way to sequester all of these Brethren related pictures we had and treat them as a separate entity. And the more we worked with that, the more we realized that seemed very Brethren centric. And we were going to create a situation for ourselves where people were going to say, well, what about the contribution of the Methodist Church? How about the Episcopalians? And it was just going to become out of hand, and it might be antagonizing. So we obviously had no interest in antagonizing anybody, and including everybody. And so we didn't want to make it that focus. So instead, what we did is we kind of sprinkled the Brethren influence throughout the entire book. And I think that was a really good decision to have done that.
I agree with that, because I know we talked about that quite a bit, because we knew that they had an influence on the community from the very beginning, but we also knew that and I knew also from living through it how like kids I went to school with in the 60s, you know, they'd say, oh, the brethren run this town. You know, well, you'd look at the city council and it was mostly brethren at that time. And, you know, I was kind of apolitical, so I didn't have much of an answer for them. But, you know, I'm sure they're, you know, they were influenced by their parents, having heard that be said. So, you know, I didn't want something like that to be repeated and come out in a, you know, many years later now than the 1960s. I didn't think we needed to still be, you know, fighting that battle.
One other thing I think I would say is that we were greatly helped in our history, a pictorial history of La Verne by Burton Frazer, who was an early photographer. He took a lot of photos of just town life during the time we were Lordsburg and then into the time of La Verne, and was a wonderful, wonderful photographer and had a lot of breadth. His collection of photos resides in the Pomona Public Library. And so we had to backtrack to the Pomona Public Library, work through their archivist, who then put us in touch with the lawyer who handles the Burton Frazer collection. And that they were more than generous with us, allowing us to use a lot of their pictures. So when you look at some of these pictures that are referenced to Burton Frazer, we were really fortunate to get these pictures because his estate wanted them out there. And they did that for us partly because we are an historical society and we weren't going to turn his pictures into like, you know, refrigerator magnets and calendars and things like that.
Burton Frazer and his wife in about 1914 actually came to La Verne and resided and had a stationery and photographic studio right where the Segal jewelry store is now, on the corner of 3rd and D. And he was there for about, I guess it was about 7 years. And then he moved his operation over to Pomona. For a short period of time, he actually maintained the business in the 2 locations, but then he went exclusively to Pomona and was there until he died. And then his son took over, and some of his descendants, I forget where they live, it's like out in Hemet or something like that, are still doing photography. And he went all over the Southwest. He had all sorts of pictures of Death Valley and things like that. He'd go up to the mountains, and I actually had an aunt, one of my mom's older sisters, that worked for him for a period of years when he was in Pomona, and then she went on and worked for another photographer. But you know, we had him right in La Verne, so we were likely to have some really good pictures because he was taking pictures of everything around town, and so we were very fortunate to have those available.
We were so lucky to have all of these photos by Burton Frazer, and Bill's right. I don't think the book would be the same if we didn't have that collection that added to it.
Yeah, that was one of my, also another thing, mentioning the businesses, that's been something that I wanted to do for years. And I organized my own files on my computer based on the year and the location. So I can, if somebody says, you know, 2116 D Street or something like that, that probably doesn't even exist. But anyway, I can look it up and say, oh yeah, and you know, 1920 there was so there, and things like that. And if any of you are familiar with the encyclopedias, or even the medical encyclopedia that would have transparencies in the center of it, they would have like the your circulatory system, you'd have the skeletal system and all that, and you could peel those away and see how that worked. A friend of mine and I had the idea that we would make something like that with maps of the city where you could say, okay, this is 1910, here's 1920, and you could tell where all these buildings were. But that was so insurmountable, we just we never did it. But having that was before computers, so that would have been really hard. But with a computer, I didn't do anything like that, but I did do the organization of the things that way, so that I can always add to it, and it'll always be sequential. And then also there's the things that are accessible online, such as the city directories. In fact, that's where most of these ads came from. They're either the city directory or the local newspaper that we had here called the La Verne Leader. And that's where a lot of those ads came from. And they are a treasure trove, and as far as this book was concerned, for certain chapters especially. So we could, and the people were, I don't want to say they were funny, but they didn't have an ad agency because of the way they advertised. It was, a real personal thing to people, and we kind of laugh at it. I know there's this one ad, I can't remember if we included it in the book, but there was an ad for a man that had a radio shop downtown, and he sold these old Atwater Kents. They had the big bait, not the real tall ones, but they had a base on them. And then they had this big old horn of a speaker that sat on that. And they were kind of noted for all that. But what he did in his ad, he listed about 40 people who had bought radios from him. He listed their names and their addresses. Nowadays, if somebody did that, there'd be laws all over the place. But in those days, it was like, wow, look, my name's in the paper. My neighbor's name is in the paper. I'm going to go buy one of those radios too, So, just little things like that you don't see now.
What's your favorite era of La Verne? I'll ask you first, Bill.
Well, I can't really choose one. We were just talking about that earlier. But I would say probably the 20s and the 30s. I have to kind of cheat and give 2 decades. It's the 20s and the 30s. I guess I really like the cars from those eras. Also, just learning about how everybody interacted. They were families that were related to each other. They'd be in, one part of the family would be in a business, and then maybe a brother-in-law would open up another business. And you'd read something and you'd think, well, I wonder how come this person, is working for this guy, and that's his brother-in-law, and things like that. So I know that's not an era thing, that can happen anytime, but I just think the 20s and 30s had an abundance of information that helped me to see how some of these things were connected, and that's when it wasn't the most growth. Later on, there was a couple of booms, but it was I don't know. It's a time that I really, really enjoyed, and I'd say because of the cars and the things that people did. People were starting to travel more, and people were starting to kind of discover the town and things like that.
Cool. Sherry, do you have a?
I do, but for a completely different reason. That's why Bill and I were essentially we're such good collaborators, because we were so not compatible in terms of many of our interests. But it did mean that we covered more bases than if we were both all interested in the same thing. And I would say from the 1900 through just before the Second World War would be my area of interest, but that's because I love architecture. And one of the aspects of La Verne that drew me to buy a house here in the first place is the old houses and the preservation of the old downtown. I grew up in Whittier and my husband grew up in Altadena, and we both lived in old craftsman houses. And that's what my husband and I looked for when we bought a house in La Verne, and we bought a 1908 Craftsman, which is an historic home, which we're busy restoring. So when Bill and I would get involved with activities for the Historical Society, like our Get on the Bus tours, he could tell you everything about all the people who live in different houses. And I wanted to visit different houses and talk about their porches and their roof lines and things like that. So it made for a really nice, a nice broad outcome with the book. But I would say it's because of how La Verne looks. And part of what makes it so charming is what are referred to as its eclectic neighborhoods. So if you drive down 3rd Street, parts of 2nd Street, Bonita, et cetera, and you look at those pre-World War II houses, people would arrange their neighborhoods so that you would have a house that was a Craftsman next to a house that was a Tudor, next to a house that was kind of Spanish style. And that all went away after the Second World War because it became about efficiency housing. And then you would see housing tracts where all the houses looked very similar. There would be maybe 3 different styles within a neighborhood, and certainly people could paint them different ways and add touches to them, but in many ways they're very similar. So when we have done some of our touring of La Verne, not only have we visited those old neighborhoods, but Bill also took us through in the tour some of the newer neighborhoods that represent the kind of all electric home era of La Verne. And who knows, we may go back to that, right? If we ever decide to outlaw natural gas use in homes, who knows what's going to happen. But I have to say that it was actually the houses in the neighborhoods that attract me the most to La Verne, and houses of a certain period of time. But part of the reason I'm attracted to old houses is the attention to detail. It's a lot of money to restore and maintain an old home. And we have a house that's on the state historic record as a Mills Act designated house. And we have worked on this house since we moved in 2001. And it's cost us more money than ever will be realized in the resale of this house. But our hope is that when we leave this house, it's going to be good for another 100 years. So that's really what it's about, is it's about that commitment to the future.
So do you have a house on 3rd Street?
Actually, we live on Bradford. Yeah, and it's the only house. Everything around us is mobile homes.
Oh, okay.
All orchards. And so when those orchards went out and were converted like to lots of mobile home neighborhoods in the 70s, everything around our house is mobile homes. Everything across the street is mobile homes. But this house is an original old grove house on about 1/3 of an acre. It's very striking in our neighborhood. You can drive around and you can say, here is an original house, here's another, and everything else is a newer build. So that was interesting. Another aspect of La Verne's architecture and its population that I didn't know much about until I'd lived here for a while is the commitment that La Verne made to mobile home construction. La Verne's very unique that way. We have how many mobile home parks, Bill? 7?
8.
Yeah, and that is, it's come to me that's actually a real benefit to the city, because it's a way that people who have more modest incomes can live very comfortably and securely. And it houses, for the most part, most of those parks are senior parks, not all of them. So La Verne's unique in that it has, I think, percentage-wise, more of a senior population than other areas. And I at first was quite intimidated about buying a house surrounded by mobile homes, and because I had no idea about them. And I think they're a real contribution to the city. That's unique.
We have a lot of information. It's really good. I guess we should ask, is there anything we missed so far?
A real unique aspect of La Verne that found its way into the book is the influence of the Church of the Brethren. And I had to live here for a number of years and have conversations with Bill before I realized that it seems that everybody's related to everybody in Laverne, except for outside people like myself, whose family line did not originate in the Church of the Brethren, and I'm not a member. But so many people who came to Laverne when it was Lordsburg stayed. And I think that has a lot to do with the Lordsburg College that then ultimately became the University of Laverne, because people sent their children here to get an education, and they married other members of the Brethren Church and then stayed. And I'm sure, Bill, you'd want to comment on that, but that I think is a very unique feature of this community that made its way into the book.
Well, one of the things I heard somebody say once is that you be careful what you talk about when you first meet somebody, because you might be talking about their uncle or their aunt or their niece or nephew or something very precious to them, and you have no clue what you're doing. So that's probably not that way so much now, because we've got a much greater population. But I'm thinking, like, when I was growing up in the late 50s or in the 60s, there were only like maybe 4,000 people or so, and now we got a lot more than that, by all means. Even though I have to laugh when I hear, "Oh, I just love this small town environment," and I go, "What?" Because I'm still living next to an orange grove in my mind, I guess, because I'm thinking of how I would go visit a friend up on White Avenue from where I lived over by the Church of the Brethren. I'd go a couple of blocks, and from then on I could go all the way through orange groves to get to the guy's house. So it just is a different world. But it's true, though, that in former times there, you look at the makeup of the city council, and when you look at the minutes of the city council meetings, or you look at articles in the paper, something like that, or you look at the businesses, like I was saying, here's so and so with this business, and his cousin has this one, and his brother-in-law has got this business. I can't say it's unique, though, because I traveled across the country, part way anyway, with a group of kids one time, and I remember staying at this motel. I thought I'd grab, this was in the 70s, I guess it was. I grabbed the local newspaper, and I started looking at it, and I go, wow, because I had already, we used to get the Laverne Leader, and I had done some research with it and that sort of thing. And here it was like deja vu, because they talk about so and so's going on a picnic in the next town, or somebody's brother-in-law was visiting them from another state, or just something like that. And that's the type of thing they put in the paper. And now you see that and you go, oh, I don't know who that is. But then it's just like that thing with the radios. Everybody knew everybody and was all excited to read these little blurbs about what their neighbors were doing.
I think I would add one more thing, and that was the impact that David and Margaret home has had on the community. That was really almost from the original days of Lordsburg, was this facility that served orphans and what was called half orphans, and still exists today in a slightly altered form as David and Margaret Youth and Family Services. So I think that reflects a real value of people who live in Laverne, and that has to do with service to the community. The concept of service, and then the concept of community involvement, which I have to say is another reason why I really love Laverne, because people really do have kind of this attitude about paying attention to each other, which is a very valuable thing to have, especially in modern times when maybe we don't feel that people pay attention.
In our research, we went to David and Margaret home and looked at their archives, and drew a lot of stuff on that, got a lot of pictures, and learned some good stories. Thinking about how how that organization involved the children. They sent them to the local schools. They would go to the local church. They were really involved, and they were, and there were groups. It was run by the Methodist Church, but there were groups from other churches, other organizations that would go out there and help them. We were just reading. I just was reading recently about a pond that they put in there, and it was the La Verne volunteer firemen that actually did the work on that. And so that was, that's certainly a non-denominational group, and just different things like that, where people would maybe bring food, and just a lot of things that made it a two-way street. The kids, I think they probably really welcomed all this, and it made them feel at home.
Bill and I also wanted to make sure in the book that we addressed really important issues like segregation of people by ethnicity into where they lived and where they worked and things like that. And so we did pay attention to La Verne's history of having a very segregated school that was known by everybody as the Mexican school, and how an end was put to that by a superintendent and Bill can fill in all the details, but how that kind of came to an end. And when you look at La Verne today, it really doesn't have kind of a lot of separate areas characterized by ethnicity. And some cities continue to be like that, although there's more diversity mixing than used to be. But I thought we needed to address some of those issues in the book.
Although the Historical Society itself is not that old. It started out, it was formed in the late 60s. And of course, there was quite a emphasis in the paper, a lot of articles to get it going. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and we have a web page, we have a newsletter, we have Facebook pages. We do a lot of promotion. Sherry's been very good at promoting these things, and those things are also getting the word out there. So I think we've got more community support. This book is a promotional tool too, and we've had people really say, "Oh, I didn't know that." Community interest, and a lot of times I feel it's maybe it's just my personality, but I'll tell somebody that I'm the city historian, or I do a lot of research for the Historical Society, and all of a sudden they're really interested. They wouldn't have been interested if I hadn't told them that. I don't know whether I thought that they would just know that. So I think the people, I don't want to say they're ripe but they are very interested in learning. People more now, I think, than ever are more interested in learning about their community.
That's really interesting what Bill said, and I would add that we would like every member of the Historical Society to kind of be an ambassador for the city and to promote the Historical Society. A long time ago, when I kind of first took the reins as president, we tackled the idea of membership, and we've kept our membership fee really very low and achievable financially by really almost everyone, and that is completely that's by design, because we really think that the Historical Society can be accessible. And so we to those people who are members who just don't email, we mail copies of the newsletter because we want to make sure that they get that. And the rest of that we post. And the newsletters I send to the city manager, and he puts them on his webpage. And so I think the city has been very supportive. And there have been a few times lately, completely unrelated to the book, where there have been changes proposed in the city, and we've been contacted. And that's important. I'd like to see more of that. And I'd like the Historical Society to be a real collaborative partner. A couple things I want to say about the book is that first, Bill and I have had a chance to look at a lot of the publications by Arcadia Publishing. And we were struck by how content-free so many of the captions were in other publications. There was just not much there. And so we paid very close attention to the word limits for the captions and went right up to the limit on every single caption we put in there because we wanted to have content and we wanted people to learn something from the pictures, not just have them up and say, oh, look, here's a picture of downtown once upon a time. And Bill is so unique about being able to add context to the photos because he has so much deep knowledge of La Verne and its residents and has a particular interest and knowledge of the business areas of downtown La Verne. And, you know, he's done a number of walking tours where he walks people up and down D Street and he can spend hours just basically almost on one location and say, here's where everything started. It's now Roberta's Village Inn, but he goes all the way back to practically when the road was not paved and tell you everything about it. And that's a depth of knowledge that is so valuable. So Bill's knowledge really shines in this book. And we've gotten a lot of good feedback about that kind of content. I think another unique aspect of our collaboration is that Bill is so rooted in La Verne and knows everybody and I mean, it's no surprise anymore that he goes, oh, your two kids' names are, and your dad's name was, and you were Camp La Verne at this. He knows all this.
Yeah.
I'm an outsider. You know, I only moved here in 2001 and did not grow up in La Verne. So I have this other unique perspective, which is that throughout the writing of this book, I would turn to Bill and say things like, why is this picture relevant? Or tell me the story about this. And it was so self-evident to Bill, but we wanted to make sure that the content of the book was made relevant to people for whom the pictures were not relevant, that we didn't know, or self-evident, I should say. And so in that way, I learned an awful lot of La Verne's history. And I think we conveyed in the book a lot about La Verne because we have to remember that people cycle in and out of this city and they need to be taught over and over again, what is the unique history of this city? And so that's what Bill's able to do. We're so lucky to have him as our city historian. If you are interested in your own copy of the Images of America book, La Verne, what you can do is you can just Google La Verne Historical Society and our website will pop up, or you can call me at area code 909-596-4679 or email me at sbest@lavernehistoricalsociety.org to order your own personal copy. We will mail the copy to you at an additional charge, or we will actually deliver it to your home personally if that's your preference. So do contact me to order your own personal copy of Images of America, La Verne.